I'm here speaking with a colleague and friend, Arthur Versluis. And if you're not aware of him, then his background is quite extensive. He's written and published dozens of books on specifically the Western esoteric tradition, such as magic and mysticism, the esoteric origins of the American Transcendentalism, American Renaissance, American gurus, the new Inquisitions, Platonic mysticism, and the latest one, which is American Gnosis, political religion and transcendence. And we chatted previously, very recently, because we both published our books together, very similar in our corresponding topics. And I wanted to get Arthur back to get a good conversation on his work, because I feel it really needs to be spoken about. So, Arthur, thanks for being here for the conversation. Always good chatting with you.
Likewise, thank you, Kingsley. And I'm sure we'll have some things that people will find interesting and provocative to think about.
I'm sure. And we just started having a bit of a pre kind of talk about your book, because I've read it and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then obviously I recommend it. It's not the kind of book that you'd often associate with Oxford University Press. And there's a wealth of material to get in there, which I hope we'll get to some interesting figures that you've covered in the book. I mentioned a few of your books, like, American Gurus and the New Inquisitions, but how did you get to a place where you could and where you wanted to write this specific book?
Well, I didn't exactly envision the book that ultimately emerged, because I wanted to explore the subjects related to Gnosticism. That was and I've done that before and over years. But I knew the general direction I was going to go, but the book itself was an exploration. So writing the book was exploring these different figures, and I wanted to include Latin American figures because they're so influential on a global scale. And so I knew that they would be in there. I knew Serrano, for example, Miguel Serrano would be in there. And Weor, this author who went by the name of Samuel Aun Weor, and some others. So I knew roughly, but the book itself, as it emerged, was really an exploration. And so what I proposed to Oxford and what actually emerged were two different things. Mm-hmm. And there are some things in the book that for sure have never been written about. There's no scholarship whatsoever on. There are others where I really rely on other scholars. And, the literature section, for example, I allow literary critics who've written about these different authors to show that these authors are all neo-Gnostic. And I just pile up the examples there. But the structure of the book, how the book emerged, the subjects in it emerged during the writing of it and the exploration. And that's what makes it exciting, because it's exciting because it's a book of exploration. And so that's something I enjoyed while I was doing it. And I enjoy now reflecting back on it, because there are so many different provocative and really entertaining things in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for those who are not fully aware, I mean, you're a professor and the chair of religious studies at the Michigan State University, and you've got away with it in a very, let's say, including in this book, you talked about Miguel Serrano, Charles Muses, Samuel Weor, David Icke, John Lamb Lash, a whole host of alt-right kind of content about Neo-Gnosticism. I mean, it's just an incredible kind of mix. So I think we'll get into that. But you explore Neo-Gnosticism quite as a kind of central aspect throughout the book. I mean, you have Gnosis, Gnostic, and Neo-Gnosticism. So just to start off with, if people aren't clear on that, I mean, you do a very good job of kind of discriminating and making a distinction between a kind of Gnosis, Gnosticism, and Neo-Gnosticism. Could you give a kind of brief kind of rundown on how you define those?
Yeah, that's something that develops a kind of taxonomy that I have worked on and first put in a book called Magic and Mysticism, which is an introduction to esoteric religion. And there I just gave, that's actually underlying the book and the organization of the book. But here what I did was just make it all explicit and expand it. And essentially it's this. I distinguish between Gnosticism in antiquity, which is a congeries of different groups, figures, movements, texts that included actually the Nag Hammadi library, a collection of Nag Hammadi texts found in a cave in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. These ancient texts included all sorts of things, Hermetic and Platonic included, but that's a phenomenon in antiquity. So Gnosticism I reserve for the actual Gnostic tradition in antiquity, in this collection of figures from the early Christian period, really roughly probably 1 to 200, 300, AD. But then in contemporary life, you see Gnostic themes everywhere. And so you can find them in films. I show how they're in films. They're explicitly in films, or implicitly. They're explicitly in games and anime. They're there in all sorts of unexpected places. Social media, all over the place. I have a collection of countless thousands of memes. And those memes, many of them are Gnostic. They're explicitly, like, they have archons in them. And, Biden as a sort of decrepit, senile demiurge figure in the White House and that sort of thing. And then you have, but you can't call that Gnostic. I mean, you could say this is Gnostic, but it's not really Gnostic in the sense of antiquity. It really doesn't have anything to do with that. It is contemporary phenomenon that we're talking about when you have Gnosticism in Cormac McCarthy's novels. It's not really Gnosticism, it's neo-Gnostic, because it's drawing on these themes of Gnosticism, like a false deluded creator or controlling archontic sort of figure, a demiurge figure. Archons as these hostile entities, the idea of gnosis as spiritual illumination, but also other kinds of illumination, not only spiritual. Gnosis can function on these different levels when it's in a contemporary context. And so I then use the term neo-Gnostic all the way through, and I actually revised the book to do that. About halfway through, I thought, I can't use the word Gnostic for this. And so then it became neo-Gnostic. I also make a distinction, and this is critical in the book, between and in other books. I've used this in a series of works now. It's very helpful. It's the distinction between cosmological and metaphysical gnosis. Cosmological gnosis, and metaphysical gnosis exist on a spectrum from dualistic to non-dual realization. So it's a spectrum. And the dualist forms of gnosis are in the cosmological category because they refer to subject-object distinction, which magic is often understood to be about. That is to say, I want X, right? Well, that's very dualistic, actually, if you think about it. But it's also about the transcendence of dualism, because the magical act is also uniting. It's an act of connecting, of making something happen, but it's still in a dualistic sphere. Whereas metaphysical gnosis is transcendence. And that's how the word gnosis is used in Buddhist translation commonly. It means, gnosis in Buddhist translation means transcendent realization. So, and that's fairly widespread. I give some examples of that, but there are many more that I could give. So that's a thumbnail version of this, but this all plays out in contemporary society. So you see it in psychedelics, psychedelic literature. You see it all over the place. And so I've worked out this larger framework, which I just kind of outlined.
Yeah, I mean, that's the crux of it, is that you're looking at the contemporary forms of this neo-Gnosticism in society, which, as you say, isn't really based on the antiquity of Gnosticism, but in the modern forms. And I suppose in my own work, I called it contemporary Gnosticism, but I should have, used that neo-Gnostic kind of tag because it's more relevant. So, I mean, people may not realize that if they're watching such as films like The Matrix or They Live or Dark City that you picked up on, that they're actually kind of engaging with these neo-Gnostic kind of terms. You say, like, Gnostic terms is dealing with a hostile world, a hostile environment. There's a kind of reality and second reality. And, you're not really in the real reality, in what I call the inversion, you call the second reality. And you're dealing with this duality. You're dealing with these kind of agents for the hostile world, which are the Archons, but in the Matrix, they're Agent Smith, and you're dealing with the idea that there's a creator or architect, which is a kind of false god, or a kind of, infiltrator, substituting the role of the real god. So all this is going on, which is bringing about, you also say this is bringing about a kind of political awakening at the same time, political gnosis. So how do you think this kind of neo-Gnostic kind of terms and understanding is bringing about a cultural awakening? Because you do refer to that kind of as a kind of trickle effect, don't you?
Well, that's true. I will say I did not expect to find some of the things that I found during the exploration that is the book. So I didn't really anticipate, even though in retrospect it makes perfect sense, but I did not anticipate finding all of these memes on the right that are they're neo-Gnostic memes, and explicitly so. And I give some examples on my website, arthurversluis.com, and the neo-Gnostic memes they're all on the right. And so that then led me to reflect on why. Well, essentially they're on the dissident right. I'll be more specific. The dissident right is the right that is people on the right that are considered persona non grata by the system. So to give an example, those people who protested after the 2020 election were then what happened to them? They go to the Capitol, they protest, and then they're subsequently hunted down. I mean, literally hunted down and jailed. And so that's the so-called January 6th. They call it an insurrection. Well, if the system hunts you down, if that's not just your perception, but it's actually happening, then it makes sense that Gnosticism, neo-Gnostic themes fit very well with that. From your perspective, as one of those, maybe one of those people, or maybe not, but people on what I call the dissident right, the self-perception is that the system is against you. So there is a political awakening that is implicit in that. So once you realize that, that's what is called being red-pilled. And then there's a proliferation of pills. The pills are white pills, for good things that happen. Black pills are feeling more pessimistic, right? And so there's this proliferation of pill memes. Then you have these figures actually revealing pills, and you have all these memes with Morpheus from the Matrix series, and all these different figures. So there is something that can be called a political awakening, and here, it's objectively neutral. In other words, I'm just saying that is how it is self-perceived, as a political awakening. And I give an example of somebody that I spoke with at some length who spoke in exactly those terms, because she said she was, quote, awakened. And I thought, well, what do you mean you're awakened? Like, in my world, that is a Buddhist world, awakened means enlightened. And people don't usually wander around saying, well, I'm enlightened now, though they do sometimes. But, sometimes it's maybe not. Maybe it's diagnosable, But in any case, in her case, I said, well, what do you mean? And from her perspective, awakening means coming to perceive that the system has become hostile to her as a normal person, right? That was her perception. And I'm not really that's a summary, but I think she would agree with that. So I give that as an example here. It's not it's not a full awakening, but she's using the term. It's not an awakening in the Buddhist sense, but it's an awakening to political realities that are maybe not politically correct, but that really didn't matter to her. So that's one kind of awakening. But the latter part of the book I'm dealing, and that kind of awakening is really in the realm of political cosmological gnosis, you could say. But so I call that Gnosticism or Neo-Gnosticism without Gnosis, because there's no Gnosis in that really, other than a kind of political awakening. But then you have also Gnosis without Gnosticism or Neo-Gnosticism, right? And that's these figures, these people who have who are on the metaphysical end of the spectrum, who have had these awakening experiences that are classic awakening experiences, and I give some examples. And I have some things to say about that, by the way. But so this is the kind of spectrum of awakening that exists within the book.
Yeah. I think we mentioned before in our last talk that, this idea of the Matrix and Neo waking up, it's not a metaphysical awakening, because, okay, he realizes that, the world is run by these robots who create the Matrix, but he doesn't get beyond the robots. He's still within the whole reality bubble, even though it's another layer. So this cosmological awakening is like, we can understand how the Neo-Gnostic memes are working for people, because they awaken to the reality that they're being scammed by the second reality, but they're not transcending beyond the reality domain. So they're still within it, but for them, it's still an awakening. And you can see how the Neo-Gnosticism ties with what's going on in the world, because, all these commentaries about the New World Order, the coming, tyranny and AI tyranny feeds into the Neo-Gnostic whole mythology, let's say. And that probably brings us into, let's start talking about some of the characters in your book, because they're fascinating. It brings us to Miguel Serrano first, because I came across him. He'd been on my radar over the years, but I've never looked into him. I never found anyone who actually studied him or put him into a scholarly context like you did. Now, Miguel Serrano was a Chilean diplomat, ambassador. He traveled in India. He wrote about his travels. He met Jung and Hermann Hesse. He was into this kind of Hermetic philosophy. And then on this side, he goes into this stream of what's known as kind of esoteric Hitlerism. And the idea that behind this, Hitler was some kind of cosmological avatar. There's a new world order tyranny coming into being. Explain more about this unusual mythology that's behind Serrano, and why, do you feel he's been deliberately kind of pushed aside in modern kind of times, or he's an odd figure, isn't he?
He's a remarkable figure. I started reading him back in the early 2000s. I published an article on him somewhere in there, which was one of the only articles out there. And at that time, I got originals of his books. A couple of them that I got from interlibrary loan came from the National Library, a national library overseas, and beautiful. I mean, these beautiful productions. So I was working with his original publications, and made kind of an initial article about him, and then let it sit for a while, and then I came back to him and actually encountered people who knew people in his circles, and I could have included them in the book, but I decided not to. I decided that my methodology in this book is to stay with, for the most part, I have a little bit of ethnography in there in different ways, but to stay with the texts. So I go through his texts and the neo-Gnostic dimensions of Serrano's worldview. And Serrano is a remarkable figure. I mean, I just have to say, in terms of what he does in these books, because here I'm talking about now, he knew Carl Jung. He did a book on his reflections on his friendship with Carl Jung. He was in the party that met the Dalai Lama when he came over from into refuge in India. Serrano had this extraordinary life, but he both on the literary life, where he published these kind of dreamlike novels or whatever they are, published by major publishers. So he had this kind of outward life that was remarkable. But then late in life, he published these books on what he called esoteric Hitlerism, in which Hitler is an avatar, and that was the secret of the Second World War. Hitler was actually an avataric figure trying to restore things, or kind of a revelatory figure. And then he goes into this kind of synthetic system, which that is what is so remarkable, because he's essentially creating this entire, or putting forward this entire complex it's a tantric system with geomantic dimensions. So there's geographic, geomantic elements to it. I mean, I can't even do it justice. There's just so much there, and I am not joking. Then there are people who have published books that are in that tradition. So they come out, and they were published. Hermitage Helm did a bunch of stuff. These books are very, very hard to get. Now, of course, since it's kind of my job, I got them. And so I have his texts in the original and in translation. I have all of these kind of subsequent texts. And what I would say is that reading Serrano is mentally quite a trip. And that I will say, and that's true of the other works that are affiliated with him. And for various reasons, his work you asked, has it been suppressed? Yeah, straight up, yes. I mean, there's just no doubt. I have no doubt of that. And I say that because they're so hard to get. Now, some things you can find, others you really have to look for, but none of it is immediately accessible in the current infrastructure. And so there's not a lot of discussion of him, but he does come up in there are different layers to the internet. There are public layers, and then and I discovered this in the course of this book, there are other layers that are not quite so public. And once you go to what I call, and I allude to it, it's called the Fediverse. Once you go into the Fediverse, Serrano's right there.
Mm-hmm.
But outside the Fediverse, not so much. So that's what I would say about Serrano. Fascinating figure. I mean, I have to say.
I think people have to, do their own research and make up their own mind. I mean, I managed to find some of his work still on Internet Archive. So if people are interested, get it while you can, because I'm sure he's going to be included in the cancel culture whenever they come across him. Because what he was saying about esoteric Hitlerism could be, seen as very controversial today. But he goes into the whole UFO realm as well, and the whole kind of, nature of the tyranny and the second reality. But I think you can find his collection of later conversations called The Widower on the Internet Archive. I might have downloaded it, so if anyone can find it, get it where you can. Also, I think Hitler as a cosmic avatar is there, and the UFO Hitler and the New World Order is there. But things like The Golden Thread, which is his major, larger work, can't find it at all. I did dig for that one. So you're reading in the original Spanish also, Arthur?
Yeah, initially, but then I just went to the translations, and I would go back and take a look, because there's so much that's available in translation. And so, I cited those largely in this book.
I think some people I've known have equated him similar to Julius Evola. I can see that because of certain kind of right tendencies to club these people together, although they're, Julius Evola was like the traditionalists, as you know. Would you put them together, or would you think they have a very different tract?
Very different. Mm-hmm. Evola, I mean, he was also an interesting figure. But they're just fundamentally different in worldview. Ultimately, there are some crossover points, I think. I know a couple of people who are really delving pretty deeply into Evola and some of the things that are not so well known. And so there'll be some new work coming out on him. And I'm not an expert. I have all of his work in English and some of his work in Italian, actually. But otherwise, I'm not that, I don't know some of these things. So there's some things to be discovered yet about him. But what makes, they each have their own world system. It's kind of a world, in that sense, they're similar. It's just that their world perspective is not at all the same. And the kind of, I would say magnitude, that the word I'm looking for is magnitude of the syncretism or synthetic nature of Serrano is very unusual. And even Evola was not doing that kind of thing, where everything gets UFOs and all kinds of things. I mean, there's totally wild stuff. I'm not endorsing Serrano and saying, well, everything in Serrano is just dandy. What I'm saying is, as a subject, he's extremely interesting. And what he's doing, I haven't seen very much of that elsewhere, So it's worth looking into, and there just has been very little. Nicholas Goodrick Clark, to whom the book is dedicated, did do some work on this, and as I say in the beginning of the book, he would have loved this. He would have joined our conversation, and he would have, what Nicholas would have done is downloaded for like 3 hours on Serrano.
Yeah. So if anyone's interested in what you're referring to, I think you're referring to his work, The Black Sun, which is looking at the roots of the occultism, Neo-Gnosticism, and Nazism, and all this kind of area around Serrano as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's an earlier book, and I draw on it. That's Nicholas Goodrick Clark. Wonderful. He was wonderful. It's such a pity that he's not with us. I've thought often about him, and I spoke to his widow not too long ago, and told her about it because I wanted to just share, at least secondhand, share this, that this was coming out and that it was dedicated to him, So yeah, and there's others. There's another figure in the book, Charles Muses.
Yeah, I was going to come to that because that's another, I think, major figure because, as we've spoken about before, he's vastly overlooked because no one can really pin him down. Even I couldn't pin him down. The only book I could kind of find was Lion Path, but his background in cybernetics, mathematics, music. But your chapter is perhaps, the most extensive, coherent, concise look at an overview of Muses' work. Yeah. So go ahead and speak on this interesting figure.
Oh, he's just extraordinary. He's almost like, someone who came from another planet or something. He's not really, he doesn't really, once you get a full sense of his life work, you start to entertain ideas like that because it's just so wild. So he was born poor in New Jersey and, relatively, lower middle class family, kind of scratching along, went to college, studied mathematics, ultimately got a PhD in the study of Dionysius Andreas Frere, who is a Christian theosopher. And then after he got his PhD at Columbia in that area, he then became editor of the Yakabuma Society publications. And I got those as part of this. And so in the ones he edited, and he included a bunch of Frere images because Frere had these amazing complex images of Christian mysticism combined with esoteric mathematics. And so you have these mathematical notations by Muses in there. And mathematical. So think about this for a moment. We're talking about a figure, 17th century, 18th century Christian mysticism in England. Then you have a 20th century author analyzing the images of Christian mysticism from this early modern period in terms of mathematical theory. That is pretty unusual, and that's just the beginning. That's like nothing compared to what happens, because then he goes to Egypt. He starts studying Egyptian architecture and religion. Then from that, he comes back, he marries this extremely wealthy woman, and then founds a publishing company that publishes the first book of Tibetan translation of its kind, Tibetan Tantra. And it's the first text, I think, one of the very first dealing with the forms of meditation called Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And then he goes from that into the sciences, and he ultimately becomes this kind of arbiter figure within, he's formally part of this scientific collaborative in Switzerland. He did that till his death. So he's working with all these major scientific figures. Mm-hmm. Then he got involved with people in California there was a whole movement in the 70s and 80s in terms of paranormal research. He got involved with that. He knew all the main figures, inspired some of them, which had all sorts of weird things I didn't even cover in there. So then he ultimately develops this thing called the Lion Path. And the Lion Path is temporal theory because he got involved in something called chronotopology, which is the topology of time, and that there are these time windows. Then he tied that in. He actually put forward a theory of astrology, a kind of language of astrology without using astrology, because astrology is actually mathematical, temporal mathematical theory. That's actually what astrology is. It's three-dimensional temporal mathematical theory. And so he just used astrological he used astrology, but in a contemporary scientific language, which again, who would even think of something like, I mean, what, where is this even coming from? Then he created the system of music. He invented a form of mathematics, or discovered it, called Musean hypernumbers. Using hypernumber theory and chronotopology combined with resonance theory, harmonics, he created a new form of music which is intended for spiritual illumination. I have all the files, all the CDs. I burned them on CDs myself. I got all of the information in this is drawn from one of his former students, who provided me with all sorts of unusual things. And so I have massive files on of Muses's life work. He ultimately became shamanic. He called his practice that he taught shamanic. Late in life, he went to Siberia and met with shamans. This is like his last year of his life. And he said, and I actually think it's probably true, that this female shaman that he met said, essentially expressed to him that they were basically in agreement, an understanding, that they understood one another. And then he came back and then suddenly vanished. You know, he was gone from the world and died. So that was it 2000, 2001, somewhere in that range. So just an amazing figure. I mean, really, I haven't even gone through everything here. I'm just giving like a thumbnail sketch.
I mean, the chapter itself is so dense of information. I can understand, like, you having, of course, a kind of resonant with him because, you know, you have also an interesting background in Christian mysticism, theosophy, Jacob Boehme, you know, same as Muses. But then how did you deal with all the mathematics? Because it gets very kind of complex. You're explaining his system, and he goes through this mathematics, and then obviously that's tied to cybernetics and music. And then the shamanistic path, it's like so varied a life in, you know, kind of such a short time. I mean, let's skip to in the 80s, he was kind of focused on the shamanic path and the lion path, right? And he had these groups, and he was doing group meetings and meditations. And it seemed to be a kind of transformative path that he was trying to give through the meditations and the music. And I listened to, thanks to you, you know, one of his music tracks, and it's unique. You really should do something with that music, and because, you know, it's not available anywhere else. So I hope that something comes of that. But he talks about, in the end of his work, the idea that man is at the evolutionary crossroads, you know, and it's almost as if this kind of like his line path preparing people for this. There's you mentioned, he talks about windows of potential opportunity, astrological moments of transformative opportunity.
That's right.
Yeah. And it seems to also tie in with what you later did at the end of the book, talking about the end of modernity, like coming to the end of a cycle. There's an opportunity here to do something. How would you see Muses, this window of opportunity tying in to this end of this notion of a kind of cyclical end, and it's our time to transcend?
Well, that's one of the many dimensions of his work, you know, and you can see on the one hand why he wasn't, you know, why this is the first thing. As far as I know, it's the first and only comprehensive overview of his entire life work in one chapter. And you can see why it was so difficult for why people wouldn't have summarized his work in the past, because first of all, you had to pull everything together. So you have to go find things. You have to explore. You have to be given the gifts, as I was by one of his former students, or one of his students, and who had compiled this vast library. But what was he really trying to do? Well, one of the things that he said was that the world that we're in is fallen or cracked. It's damaged. It's damaged, and because of it, the damage of the cosmos, this kind of damage or fallenness, there's a parasitic element that can gain power within it. And so he was pretty apocalyptic in a period which was actually externally fairly prosperous and, in American history, but he was pessimistic about the contemporary society, and he saw things and argued about things that now are confirmed in different ways by other people. But at that time must have seemed to many people to be those who were aware of them, not necessarily reflecting the actual society. Now it makes a little, it's become more widespread, this kind of understanding. But the underlying ideas are that society is, especially communist society, he describes as a kind of fungus on human life. He uses the word fungus. It's like a fungus. And what he meant was ant society, bureaucratic society under the power of, managerial figures for their own exploitation or for power or whatever. And he had nothing really but contempt for that. What he put forward was the system using temporal windows and this idea of music resonance, harmonic resonances that retune our subtle body in order to allow us to go to fulfill our destiny, which is to it's a kind of essentially cosmological transcendence. Mm-hmm. And our evolution can continue on other worlds where we don't have this parasitic dimension. That's essentially what the Lion Path is about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in a way, this is why obviously you've tied him into this lineage in the book, because what Muses is saying about this fungi, this parasitic world, is similar to what Miguel Serrano is talking about, this kind of totalitarian rising up in the world. And both of them would have seen kind of quite, to a lot of people who are not kind of tuned into that understanding, quite wacky when they were writing at that time. But now, as the world as it is, and that's why I think American Gnosis is a significant book, because it's actually showing that this is now reflecting what's happening in the world in the current times. And so we can talk about this, and people say, yeah, I can kind of relate to that, a parasitic world, a tyrannical order. I can relate to that because it's actually kind of unfolding in many ways. And so this idea of this kind of fallen world and this crack where the parasitic element or entity comes in, as Muses talks about, kind of ties in very well with this Archontic Neo-Gnosticism, which is another kind of category of Neo-Gnosticism that you delve into in the rabbit hole. And you bring in, this is where you bring in, I love it when you bring in David Icke and put him beside like John Lamb Lash and other people. So for those people, again, how would you kind of define Archontic Neo-Gnosticism? Because we've talked about archons already in our conversation. And it's a kind of like, it's another extension of Neo-Gnosticism, or let's say more amplified, and bringing in those people like David Icke who are talking about shapeshifters, reptilians, and the work of John Lamb Lash. So, and it seems like you seem to be a little kind of, well, I suppose, rightly critical of John Lamb Lash and a bit sympathetic to David Icke in the way you presented them. So, could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, really, I try as much as I can to, to just objectively discuss these different works and figures and so on. And, in doing that, sometimes what you're revealing, and that's true throughout the book. I mean, Jocelyn Godwin said about the book that it includes some unsavory characters, but then so did Gnosticism in the past. Mm-hmm. Something like that, which is that dry British humor, and he's right. So in the case of David Icke, I include him, even though obviously he's not American, but he is influential. And without David Icke, if I didn't discuss him, then the whole reptilian theme, because he has this, his early work is all about shape-shifting reptilians from another dimension, controlling things. And if I don't bring that in, because that meme, that kind of theme, has made its way into popular culture, and it's out there. So it's really out there. I mean, it's really out there. So there's memes of, lizard people, like, what was one I saw recently? There was one where I think it was the Bushes and the Bush family and some others, and they're kind of gathered together, and you see these lizard skins, like parts of them are lizard, right? Well, that makes no sense as a meme. None. Unless you know about the reptilian shape-shifting, ruling the world kind of thing, or trying to control the world. That theme, which David Icke was instrumental in putting out there. Also, he is very widely distributed. He distributes himself. He is excellent at self-promotion. And so he gets his memes out there, and so he's present on Gab and other places on, in social media that will allow it. Not everybody will allow it, obviously, but those that will, then he's out there. And so David Icke also has this dimension of becoming closer and closer in what he writes to what I describe as, in the book, term, and is self-described by themselves, which is why I use the term, the dissident right, the American dissident right. And I show that what he's writing is very close to it. But he also has this element of yoga and spiritual awakening that he emphasizes. He's not just pessimistic. David Icke is not just saying, oh, well, these reptilians. This is a thing with Serrano and some of these figures, is that there is a pretty pessimistic dimension to it, really, because there isn't any transcendent dimension really there. In David Icke, there's that, he keeps that door open. That's what I would say. And he points to it. Yeah. Now, John Lamb Lash, I have to include him because he is very clearly discussing Gnosticism in terms of Gnostic texts, in terms of the contemporary world, and he in his not in his image, that book by him has some reach. I mean, that book got reached a fair number of people. He also, and there's a little bit of bad blood between the two of them, and I discussed that, David Icke and John Lamb Lash, but basically they're both talking about archons, these hostile entities that are hostile to human awakening. They're both writing about awakening. They're both John Lamb Lash emphasizes Sophia and Sophianic aspect of awakening. he also has been involved in something called the Kalika War Party, which is sort of black magic, directed against popular figures. And you can read more about that in the book if you want to. But essentially, I just sketch these folks, and it's not a matter of my, putting in my own kind of assessment too much. Occasionally I have a joke, I have to say. I do have jokes in there. There's straight up jokes in the book. And, I just couldn't resist. I had to do it.
Well, I think, the material is so kind of, dense, I think you need a bit of humor. But I think that's probably what I picked up on is that difference is that, I used to live literally down the road from John Lash when I was in Andalusia. He was the other side of the mountain. I didn't realize that until right at the end. But of course, David Icke always says that, we are a spirit having an incarnation in human body, so we are principally spirit. And so there's that kind of positive kind of, some people may call it a new age element, but you could call it a kind of metaphysical gnosis element that, he does emphasize that there's a way to leave the reality bubble, And John Lash, I read his Not in His Image book, and I thought, there's a lot of material here. I liked how he tied in Sophia with Archons, with the kind of environmental context. But I didn't know about the Kalika War Party. And when I looked it up in your book, that's kind of scary, because he's actually showing in his videos to do some kind of rituals with string tying around trees to put a black magic spell on people, and that is, he's propagating harm in a way, isn't he? It's a kind of revolutionary act he's propagating. So he has this kind of cosmological, let's say, theoretical part of what he's promoting, and then behind the scenes he's got this kind of revolutionary act through black magic, which impacts physically onto people. And that's very odd when I looked at that side of it. It's not promoted, but you picked it up and you do give links to that. And it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, doesn't it? That side of his work, I think.
Well, it's a little bit similar to Peter Lamborn Wilson, who published under the name Hakim Bey. Mm-hmm. And to this day, people think that Hakim Bey is like not, he's like Hakim Bey, that there's, that more than that pseudonym took on more than ordinary life, put it that way. Well, Hakim Bey, in some of his books, espoused poetic terrorism and kind of anarchic acts, and he had real effects in this world. When Peter Lamborn Wilson did, when the anarchists took over and created their attempt at utopia in Seattle a few years ago, their language was straight up Hakim Bey. It came from Hakim Bey. And the reason I mention this is that the things we do have effects, right? That is when we, and by we I mean authors, publish things, then those things, those ideas go out into the world. And so that's an example of that. It's indisputable. The language temporary autonomous zone was Peter Lamborn Wilson / Hakim Bey. That's his language. And there are some similarities actually between, some of the things we're talking about here and that. So I thought I'd bring it in, although he's not in the book. He's in a previous book. American Gurus. Yeah. And I also did an interview with Peter Lamborn Wilson, published a conversation with him where there's some very interesting things about his history most people didn't know. He was quite forthcoming. We just sat there with this New York Times reporter sitting there, sort of baffled that what on earth we were talking about. And he would puff away on his cannabis and declaim in this complicated prose his history. And so that was Peter Lamborn Wilson. It's just very entertaining. He's a wonderful figure, actually. He really was in some ways. In other ways, though,
Mm-hmm.
there's a dark side, and I would say that with a number of these people, but that doesn't, I'm going to write about them.
Sure,
you
sure.
know.
Well, you did. I mean, you wrote about chaos magic as well. I mean, people who aren't aware of chaos magic don't know the words of like Peter Carroll, for example. I mean, in Britain, I'm more exposed to chaos magic because there was quite a phenomenon of chaos magic with authors
hmm
like Carroll, of course, and it ties into, I suppose, it's a further down the line from the magic of Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn and the Thelemite magic. And you talk about chaos magic, and at that time, I suppose, I'm reminded of authors that were around that, such as coming from the I think the New Dawn publication house, Falcon Press for publication. So you had Christopher Hyatt, you had Robert Anton Wilson, you had Timothy Leary, you had Israel Regardie, and you had Principia Discordia, and that kind of chaos and chaos magic, which I suppose I think you covered some of that in Robert Anton Wilson, American Gurus. So that chaos magic kind of fits into this kind of neo-Gnosticism, as you showed in the book, which some people may not have picked up on previously. So it shows that all these social cultural subgroupings that have been around in the 20th century are now kind of coalescing into this neo-Gnosticism mythology, which now is tying into, or people are relating to, the New World Order mythology that's happening on the physical level. So there's an interplay which is all coalescing now, and I think you showed the threads of that in your book. So it's timely in its time, and something's happening, isn't it?
It is, and it's one of the things that I do also is I have a section of the book where I discuss essentially theories of history, and the reason I do that is to show that there are different but intersecting ways of understanding the moment at which we find ourselves now. And by moment, I mean more than just this exact moment. I mean the kind of sense which is widespread in the dissident right, and more widespread than that, I think, because I've seen it expressed by people on the left as well, that we're at a transition point. Some people describe it as the end of the modern age, end of modernity, meaning liberal modernity, really, the kind of liberal thought that existed, in the, say, 1950s or 1920s or 1890, the kind of world that was produced by that way of thinking is coming to an end. And this is argued by quite a number of people, and I give some examples of that, going back to Spengler, of course, but also Romano Guardini, who's coming from a Catholic point of view, and a whole array, that we're at this kind of inflection point, and that it's not clear which direction we're going to go, that it could be a kind of tyrannical future, or it could be a much more utopian one. What does it mean to say we're at the end of modernity, right? So there's a whole set of questions here. Some people in the book are ultimately very optimistic, and I give the example of Chris Bache, who's he's an author in the psychedelic realm, professor of religious studies, published these remarkable books. One is called Dark Night, Early Dawn, where it's essentially prophetic. Well, his prophetic view is that we're going to go through a tremendous crisis, and the crisis will try all of humanity, but on the other side, we will have given up many of our confused ways of seeing the world, and a much more happy and balanced way of life will exist. So that is a pretty fair summary of what's in that book.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a point of view. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I wanted to come to the kind of latter part of the book and the end of modernity. I mean, Chris Bash, I remember about 20 years ago reading his Dark Night, Early Dawn. I mean, 2 years ago, he kind of updated it and released his kind of overview with, it's called LSD and something of the Diamonds of the Universe, or
Diamonds from Heaven. That was the original title was Diamonds from Heaven.
Yeah. So he would probably start. I had a chat with him a couple of years ago, actually. But yeah, Dark Night, Early Dawn. I remember that it was so powerful because he had these visions of the whole planet going through this dark night of the soul, where there was chaos and disruption and a whole kind of global upheaval, and then this new dawn coming from it, and the whole new world coming from it. But of course, the crisis was very deep, you know. And I remember I took out those extracts 20 years ago, and I thought they're so profound. I took them out and I shared them on my email to a few of my friends, and they all thought I was nuts. So I didn't get any feedback from it, but I've actually quoted those extracts in some of my work and my books over the years, because I think they're one of the kind of most profound prophetic snapshots of what we can see ourselves going through, because we it's not about seeing this on just a personal individual level, or even on a community or a national level or a civilizational level. We have to see it on a cosmological level. And I think, Chris Bash does the job of that. So I think what you're pointing to is like these kind of end times and beginning times, these windows of time moments, as Muses would say. And in the end of modernity, your final, one of your later chapters, you look at that and how some people like Rene Guénon saw these cyclic, movements, and he tied it into the Vedanta and the Hindu doctrine and cosmology. And you're saying there's various kind of models to look at this. And I was interested in Romano Guardini. No, haven't come across him, but he seems an interesting figure. And also Nicholas Beredev. Am I saying it correct? And I've also used his work, and you looked at the beginning and the end. So you've taken some kind of different figures from different areas to show that these are transformative times. And I got the feeling that you wanted to show also through the book that what we're seeing is all this kind of like, these figures are prophetic in their own right. But when you stitch them together, we can see a bigger tapestry, and we're going through a critical moment in our civilizational time. And it comes to the crux when you end the book and you're saying, now's the time to decide what it means to be fully human. And I think that's what you're really asking every reader to look at, isn't it? Do we want to go through a kind of anti-human path, which could be seen as these neo-Gnostic memes of tyranny and new world order and AI kind of control and encampment, or the transformative, transcendental, Gnostic metaphysical pathway? And that's what you're offering, is it? That's what I felt you was offering at the end of the book.
Yeah, the final sentence is very much along those lines, that it's in our hands which path we want to take. And one of the things that happened in the writing of the book is it became clear that there are a lot of parallels, that there's the individual picture of this or that author, which is Muses or whoever I'm looking at, but then there's the larger picture where you have their intersection. And there are a lot of points of the book where I say, well, this is pretty much what this other figure were also saying. And there's some chapters where I'm actually comparing and contrasting, these different figures, and they're basically along some, pretty similar lines. And it is absolutely true what you're saying, that there's the density of the particular parts of the book, and then there's the larger perspective, that the perspectives that you get from looking at the whole and what people are saying. And what ultimately the book also discusses toward the end is something called future gnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And future gnosis includes it draws on what is really an emergent, I would say, movement, which is there also in the book American Gurus, and that is America, the United States, has had a history going back to the 19th century, which I published about, this massive book, American Transcendentalism and Asian Religions,
Mm-hmm.
American Transcendentalism. Before that, even Jonathan Edwards, you had these figures that come out of a Christian world, but ultimately, in the case of Transcendentalism, are perennial and putting forth a perennial path, a non-sectarian path. And you have people in the book now doing that, in people that I refer to who are alive now or died, not that long ago, like Franklin Merrill Wolff, who are putting forward a non-sectarian, distinctly American path, spiritual path. That includes someone that has not been published on before, to my knowledge, and that's Joel Morwood. So I discuss him and his institute for his Spirituality Institute in Oregon. All of these are pointing toward something. So there's the discussion of them individually. Then there's the larger things that they're pointing to or that they're revealing. And it's not that I actually am critical at some points of some of these things. I'm not totally just, putting them forward. So I call into question some of this. I'm not completely endorsing it. But what I'm saying is that whether I like it or not, there is a non-sectarian spiritual path emerging. And there it is. You can see it. Mm-hmm. So there also is this heady brew of paganism and Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, and it's all kind of together, whether we like it or not, in the American mix. And so that is creating something new. And it's continuing to develop. And so that's part of the book as well. And Future Gnosis is also about how that is developing. And that's why I mention in it Hyros Institute, because I'm drawing on some things actually from Hyros in order to discuss Future Gnosis. So that's what I would say about this latter part of the book.
Yeah. And I would suggest people to look up Hyros Institute for the work there, the materials, the courses, and not least our previous interviews on there. Yeah. So I mean, there's so many threads in the book that we don't really have time to discuss because you bring together, of course, the kind of literature, history. You've got the 20th century and 19th century writers, Edgar Allan Poe and Hawthorne. You bring in Philip K. Dick and William Gibson. So there's so much there. But I think we probably have to wrap it up soon. But people would have to read your book and kind of take it slowly and chew on it. So would from your own point of view, then, Arthur, would you say that it seems like we're coming to a time where we need some transformative moment or some transcendental potential in humankind at this time to get through this kind of juncture or crisis point?
I think that's what Heidegger said. Isn't that a famous remark Heidegger said? Only a God can save us. I think that's a remark that Heidegger made in an interview at one point. And I'm not necessarily saying only a God can save us, but I do think what the book shows is that there is a larger picture, and a lot of what is in the book is very, if I had your book, most recent book, the inversion, at that time, at the time of writing this book, it would be in there. For sure, it would be in there.
Along with the fellow Leicester-born David Icke, we'll both be in there, two Leicester lads.
Well, the thing is, there's the granular level, but then there's the kind of meta level. And at the meta level, what the book shows is very provocative about the nature of our world and calls into question a lot of things that people otherwise might have thought about, but not suddenly seen in this different light. And so there are different levels to this book, and its aim is to provoke some of these questions through study. I mean, just objectively looking at these different patterns and how these patterns emerge, you can come to some larger understanding. And is that understanding itself the kind of transformation that you're talking about? To some extent it is, because if you don't have the perception and the awareness, then the capacity for realization is not there, because you don't even know it exists, right? Yeah. So that's that element is implicit in the book, and so I just enjoy talking about it. I enjoyed writing it, and it gives me pleasure to reflect back on it. And it's beautiful cover. I do really like the cover.
I love the cover, and I think it did a great job of seeding this work into at least the scholarly community, and I hope also into the general reader. And as you say, it comes back full circle, because you mentioned at the end the lady at the beginning who said, "I'm awakened," in a sense of a gnosis, or gnosis to the construct of the second reality, and yes. As you say, we have to start from some basis of awareness, and we can't go straight to full transcendence. If you do, you've been graced, but otherwise you have to do the work, and you have to get past the first gateway or the first gatekeepers into some form of awakening to the second reality. So Arthur, finally, wherefore from here? I mean, what can you write after this? Any plans, any kind of clues of where you would go from here?
Well, at some point, I may return to the kind of scholarly academic world, but right now I'm doing a book. I finished a book on alchemy and light, and it deals with many of the subjects that we have talked about today, but from a completely different perspective. And that book is contracted with Inner Traditions, so that'll come out sometime probably next year, and it'll be tied to alchemical practices, which I've also been exploring with an elder mentor in all of this, who has devoted his entire life to this work. And so we've done a series of conversations. We finished the last one this past Saturday, which is the conclusion. And it is, he is revealing how you work with alchemy and alchemical practice and spiritually in ways that are directly related to many of the themes we've talked about, but has never been made available before in this way. And so that will come out eventually, but these things are all interrelated. So they're all one. They just look a little different in how they appear.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I mean, hopefully we'll have another chat when Alchemy and Light comes out, and I'll get my teeth into that. And I'll put a link below also to Heros Institute for people to look at more of the resources and your work there. So Arthur, thanks. I really enjoyed chatting with you as always. Your depth of info and a lot more. So thanks for chatting.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Kingsley. It's been wonderful as always.
All right. Cheers now.